Shields and swords, feel the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Now, when I was a student, I got a lot of lessons about writing essays. But the truth is, beyond how to put together a sentence and grammar and spelling, I didn't get a lot of practical information about how to write an essay. It was just kind of assumed by my teachers and then later my professors that I already knew how to write an essay. You know how to write a sentence, right? You know how to write a paragraph, right? Slap an introduction and conclusion on that, and you got yourself a good paper. Well, that's not exactly right. And through trial and error, I eventually figured it out, as most students do. But I shouldn't have had to have all that trial and error. So today I want to talk to you about practical elements of drafting an essay. And I'm going to be talking broadly. So if you're talking about a narration essay or a cause and effect essay, an argumentation essay, description essay, whatever kind of essay you're writing, there will have to be some adjustment of this to the type or genre of essay that you're writing, but these are generally the rules. So first of all, when we're talking about drafting the essay, we're assuming for these purposes that if there's any research, you've already done the research. If there's any, that you've already prepared, you already have an outline, you already have written down a thesis. It's important to already have your outline and thesis ready to go. Okay, so we're assuming you have your pre-writing done, that you've already done all your planning. So what do you do? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to create mental space for yourself. What do I mean by creating mental space? Well, first of all, you have to make sure that you have enough time and you're not up against other deadlines. And I don't just mean deadlines in terms of this assignment is due tomorrow at 9 a.m. I mean deadlines like I'm supposed to meet my friend for dinner at 6 o'clock. Anything in your life that's creating a deadline, you don't want to be pushing against that. Because if you're pushing against that, it's going to distract you from writing a really good paper, the kind of paper that you want to write. So give yourself enough time. In my own case, I know that if I sit down to start writing, probably the first 15 minutes of it, I'm just messing around. I'm organizing things on my desk. I'm rereading what I wrote before. I'm trying to get my brain in the right place. And I also know that the last 15 minutes before I'm done writing, already my brain is already moving on to the next thing I'm doing. I'm meeting my friend. I need to think about what I'm making for dinner. And so what I know about myself is, if I have an hour to write, really what that really means is I only have a half hour of real drafting time. And so it's going to depend on how quickly your mind can shift from one thing to another. But I generally do not sit down and try to write anything unless I have a solid hour in which to get a half hour's work done. Now, if I have 2 hours, I still take 15 minutes on the beginning and 15 minutes on the end, and now I have an hour and a half, right? So if I get a big block of time, I can do more. Again, this is going to depend on how you work. Now, someone out there right now is saying to themselves, I work best under pressure. And that is not true. You don't work best under pressure. You only work under pressure. You refuse to work any other time, so you don't know what good work is. And that's the problem. All right, so you want to give yourself enough time. You want to make sure that your pre-writing is complete. So you want to make sure that you have yourself a clear written thesis statement, and you have already solidly outlined what you want to say. And that thesis statement outline are important because what that means is if you get stuck, you can just keep going. You're just plugging things into a pre-existing structure that you've already made. And so you know how sometimes people will say that they get writer's block? Well, a lot of writer's block is simply because they haven't planned things out. That's not the only kind of writer's block, but that is a lot of it. Let me give you an example. One time when I was in grad school, I got really bad writer's block. I mean, true writer's block. And I had to write my papers. I had no way of getting around it. So what did I do? Well, I started by outlining. And then I tried to write, but I still couldn't. So I added more details to the outline, and I still couldn't do it. So I added more detail. I still couldn't. I started putting the quotes that would be my evidence in the outline. And I added more and more detail to the outline until I realized I basically already had written the paper, and all I had to do was take these little phrases and turn them into sentences, and they would become a paper. And indeed, that's what happened. And it worked into a very nice paper. I wrote a 20-page paper, basically just expanding an outline, not writing from beginning to end. That's the power of having your pre-writing complete. And then also be willing to make mistakes. When you sit down to draft, don't worry about spelling errors. Don't worry about grammatical errors. Don't worry about your citations. Don't worry about getting those things right, because you're going to revise. Good writing technique involves revising. And if you know you're going to revise, then you can sit down and get that first draft done, and then you have the raw material that you can work with to make a really solid draft. Okay. So in order to have a good experience in drafting, you have to already do your pre-writing and plan and commit to revising afterward. Okay, so what does the essay then look like? Well, let's start with the start. Let's start with the introduction. So the introduction has two real points. The first one is to bring the reader in, and the second one is, to establish for the reader what the paper's about. Now, what the paper's about is generally the thesis statement, and often there's a kind of sentence. Often there are a sentence or two before that talking about the topic before you get to the thesis statement, where you're saying, if you're writing a paper, for example, about the life cycle of squirrels, right? Then you might talk about squirrels a little bit, so that they already know that squirrels are the subject matter, and then you get into your thesis. But how do you engage the reader? Well, there's a lot of ways to do that. One thing is, if you have a little known and interesting fact, not a boring fact, interesting fact, you might want to open with that. You might open with a challenging question. You might open with a quotation. However, many students will open with a dictionary definition, and that's almost always a bad idea. That's almost always a bad idea because in most cases you're defining a term that the reader already knows. So for example, if I assign students a paper and I say, write about the role of women in Anglo-Saxon poetry, then a good number of students will open with Webster's dictionary defines women as the female of the gender, or something like this, which has two problems. First, it insults the reader by saying, reader, you're so stupid you don't know what a woman is, which obviously, aside from the fact that everyone knows that, it's in the prompt, so the person who assigned it knows this. And second, it's just boring. It's so boring, right? So if you have a quotation, ask yourself, is this relevant and is it interesting? Okay. You might try a brief story or a brief anecdote. I often tell inexperienced writers to be careful about this because people love talking about themselves. And very often a student will start telling a story about themselves that leads into it, and then that story becomes a third of their paper. Okay. Very brief. Okay. So you want to establish the direction. You want to engage the reader and establish the direction. Okay. What happens when you get into the body of the paper? Well, you should already understand that a paragraph is all around one main point, right? And so if you're writing scholarly research, you should have one main point, and I would argue one piece of evidence at least per paragraph. Now, when I say one piece of evidence, does that mean you have to have a quotation or a citation in each paragraph? Not necessarily, right? It can also mean you've subdivided the argument down to such a way that your evidence in there is simply a logical conclusion that you're drawing from some earlier evidence, or that you're going to support with some later evidence, right? But when you're looking at the body of your paper and going through each body paragraph, ask yourself, do I have evidence for this? Now, of course, for some kinds of things like narrative writing, you don't have that kind of evidence. Instead, it might be scene by scene or feeling by feeling, right? But each one should be organized around a particular idea. And each paragraph, the point of the paragraph is to advance the thesis, advance the argument, advance the point. If you find you have a beautiful paragraph, well written and interesting and exciting, but it doesn't advance your thesis, doesn't belong in the paper. I'm sorry, you're going to have to get rid of it in that case. You're going to want to test your ideas. You're going to want to ask yourself, how might the reader object to what I'm saying? And then you need to anticipate their objections and respond to them as you go through. And you want to do so fairly. If you ever use the phrase, as everyone knows, well, not everyone knows that. If everyone knows it, why are you saying it? In most cases, people say that because they just don't want to provide evidence for something that not everyone agrees with, right? This is why I always tell students, be very careful if you ever use the word obvious in your academic writing. If you use the word obvious, then the question is, should you be writing this? If it is truly obvious, why are you writing it? If it is not obvious, then don't say it's obvious. Okay. So as you're going through the body, you want to focus on this idea of always getting back to the thesis. Does this paragraph support the thesis? Does the next paragraph support the thesis? Does the next one support the thesis? And then finally, when you get to the conclusion, you want to be able to restate the original point, but you don't want to do it in the same way, because by now you should have earned more detail or a stronger way of doing it. And then you should lead the reader out comfortably so the reader feels like this is the end. Have you ever been watching a movie or something and suddenly the credits roll and you say, that was it? That's the end? Your paper shouldn't be that way. This is why I often tell students you should not begin a conclusion paragraph by saying, in conclusion. Why? Well, the phrase in conclusion is not bad in itself. But if you have to say in conclusion, that means that it is not necessarily clear to your reader that you're concluding it. It should feel like they're concluding it. In the same way that if you're watching a movie and it's about to come to the end, you feel the ending coming, right? You know it's coming. They don't have to suddenly say, the movie's about to end. You should feel it, and people should feel the same thing. How's that? Well, you might want to show the implications of what you've suggested, or look ahead. Or if you're arguing for something, you might list the benefits. There are all sorts of ways that you can guide someone out of your essay. But you're going to want to structure your essay in such a way that when it comes to the end, the reader says, there's the end. And I knew it was coming. I felt it coming. And I think I agree with the person, and I'm going to think more about what they had to say. So when you're drafting an essay, take a very practical approach. These theoretical things are important. They are important, right? But they are less important when you're an inexperienced writer, and they become much more important when you become an experienced writer. And as you go further on and you become more experienced as a writer, then it's time to start thinking about all the theoretical things that your various teachers taught you, because those things are important, but you've got to get the kind of basic technique down first.